Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us today. My name's Corey McNair, and welcome to our webinar on unlocking stimulus spending through alliance contracting. Most of us now are starting to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, and policymakers in all of our countries are starting to look and talk about stimulus spending as a way to spark job growth and get the economy boosted. Like 2008, infrastructure is intended to be a large portion of that stimulus spending. It's seen as a job creator, a way to get people to work very quickly and kickstart the economy in a time of need. Like 2008 as well, there are different ways of spending that stimulus money, and there are varying degrees of success in the way we spend stimulus money on infrastructure. There's a balance that government and policymakers need to create jobs quickly versus maximizing long-term sustainable growth through infrastructure spending. But there doesn't always have to be. Alliance contracting has proven to be a model where stimulus money can be spent very quickly for post-pandemic, post-recession, or post-emergency situations. We've put together a panel list of many of our global experts. If we go to our next slide, Karina, our global experts have over a century of work and expertise in the infrastructure space. First is Jeff Sider. Jeff is the VP of Global Advisory for WSP Canada and has been advising global clients on infrastructure delivery models, streamlining pre-procurement phases of infrastructure projects, and managing the interfaces between public owners and the private sector. Next is Michael Myers. Michael Myers is a strategic advisor for WSP USA. He's also been a longtime professor at both MIT and Georgia Tech. He's the Director of Transportation and Transportation Planning for the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. And he's been working over 45 years with different types of delivery models. Mike Dalton is the Business Development Director for WSP UK's Transportation and Infrastructure business. He's been in consultancy for more than 30 years and has worked closely with the UK's major infrastructure operators and owners. Tim Gospel is the Regional Director of Victoria in Australia and has worked over 20 years with collaborative contracting, delivering governance experience in the alliance model. And finally, Simon Robinson is currently the head of project management and is a project director with WSP in Churchill, New Zealand. He has governance roles on a range of transportation projects, including alliancing. With that, if we go quickly to the agenda, over the next 30 minutes, we're going to walk you around the world through countries with different maturity levels in alliance contracting, and first hit on North America, both in Canada and the US, and go over some of the issues that have plagued stimulus spending over the last few recessions. We'll get into the UK and Australia. We'll show you that alliancing models can be used effectively to streamline procurement and get stimulus money spent. With that, Jeff, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Corey. So for context, I'd like to take a look back to the global financial crisis of 2008 in Canada with a view to understanding why 2020 is different from an infrastructure delivery perspective. Approximately $35 billion in stimulus in 2008, of which $12 billion was for infrastructure, was reported to have resulted in considerable deficits and annual debt service costs, not unexpected. But the fact that that studies show that only 1.2% of growth over 3.5 years was the result of stimulus was actually attributed to 0.1% of that was attributed rather to stimulus. So stimulus really only around 0.1% of the growth, not entirely successful, one would argue, but certainly a very successful recovery. 2008 was a demand-side recession where there's a fear of depression, but life continued. 2020 is a supply-side shock recession, palpable anxiety, air travel stopped, borders closed, high mortality rates. No amount of money would put people into the middle seat of an aircraft. 2008 focus on shovel-ready project, where 2020 stimulus funding is now focused on shovel-worthy and getting the supply chain back to work. In 2008, infrastructure delivery was mainly through PPPs. We now find that PPPs are facing certain challenges, public-private partnerships. Risks are downloaded to designers, contractors. There has been a tough luck response by the owners. Contractors have been hit by supply chain impact, and it's not entirely accepted that COVID is in fact force majeure. In 2020, while stimulus focused on keeping the economy from going into a tailspin, we're seeing both opportunities and challenges. The opportunities is now different to 2008. We are far more focused on smart infrastructure. This is the opportunity that we're now facing. We're doing a lot of work in such technology challenges in transitioning into transit electrification, toll highway traffic revenue management, artificial intelligence and automated vehicles. There are various other smart technology and infrastructure initiatives. And we've been transitioning to a different frameworks for the delivery and more effective and collaborative models. The challenge, and frankly, the Government of Canada's focus is on climate resiliency. Climate resiliency is now the driving force for infrastructure decisions in the Canadian government's focus for its stimulus. Environmental and global warming is seen as a possible second pandemic looming in the background. If we can go to the next slide. So getting back to where we are now, the construction accounts for approximately 7% of GDP in Canada. It's viewed as the barometer for Canadian economic health. So we cannot afford to ignore the importance of infrastructure on economic recovery and robustness, with 1.5 to 3 times multiples on infrastructure development and almost 10 jobs per $1 million investment. The issue is that stimulus funding alone is insufficient to break the impasse that we need to, in pulling the economy out of a recession. It needs to be directed to worthy infrastructure and better structure for delivery. So these collaborative models are those frameworks that will provide this stimulus, but we need to, there are certain challenges that we see with them. We can go to the next slide. The one size fits all in terms of delivery vehicles is it just isn't there. In Canada, we've been using the PPP model. It's been the go-to vehicle for infrastructure development, and even before COVID, the industry is questioning the robustness of this PPP model. The rationale for PPPs in Canada, and frankly for around the world, has been certainty, cost certainty, risk certainty, life cycle certainty, but it hasn't been working. These risk allocation to the partner best positioned to manage the risk has been risk allocation at all costs. So if we go to the next slide, the certainty premises of PPP, the tough luck stance of owners, and the aggressive bids by the market, overlaid by this black swan shock of COVID, has led up to a complete breakdown of the PPP premise. Procurement is inflexible, costly, and time-consuming. 2 to 3 years before shovels hit the ground. I've been involved in a project where I was engaged in 2008 to do a business case on the project. 2009, they did the concept design. 2011, they went to RFQ. 2012 to the RFP. 2013 was the financial close and shovels in the ground. 2019 was revenue service, and dispute resolution will be in 2021. That is 7 years before you get through to continued operations or sustainable operations. It's simply not, by the time you get out to get shovels in the ground using these traditional models, we've already hitting the upside of the economy. So innovation is stifled, contracts are deficient, insurance was seen as a source of revenue. And no insurers are simply not insuring these projects, and contractors, concessionaires are not responding to the RFPs. So the market has been looking for an overhaul. If you go to the next slide, there two things are happening in retooling this delivery model in Canada. Renegotiation, we're looking at seeing some renegotiation of existing public-private partnership contracts. Stick to the terms of the contract. This tough luck stance of traditional views are leading to disputes, and worse still to default in terms of and if we look back, look at the UK's Carillion, which impacted the PPP concessions across Canada as well. Fast track models, usually used for priority projects, became very popular in the 1970s and 1980s to provide for speed to get shovels in the ground following high interest rates of the oil crisis. Fast track do get shovels in the ground quickly. They can generate significant cost savings and time certainty, but requires commitment, collaboration, cooperation, and communications, 4 C's. The challenge is twofold. Firstly, how to advance the procurement and cut the pre-procurement phase. We've done this with such clients as the Port of Vancouver in Canada, with ECE, early contract engagement, and some progressive contracting. And we're seeing openness to collaborative arrangements more commonly used in vertical infrastructure, and arrangements we'll discuss a little later on today. And secondly, how to evolve from this fast track projects to a collaborative program arrangement, and that's really a cultural change. So I see that if you go to the next slide, I've basically put out four points that need to happen in Canada. First, these are basic requirements that need to be addressed in moving forward to a collaborative program alliance for or IPD, integrated project development. Number one is streamlined procurement. We need to streamline pre-procurement planning, improve flexibility, embrace digital delivery. Now, we know that our procurement process has been enormously inflexible. We need to streamline them and become a lot more flexible. We need to have clear and transparent collaborative governance structures, owner, concessionaire, builder, designer, an integrated team with alignment of interests, and very importantly, clarity of expectations. And that's one of the things that has always been a challenge to, as we've been thinking about these new models, is what is the clarity of expectations. The third one rather, is to reduce bid costs and risk, remove hurdles from fast track planning, environmental approvals. In Canada, we've struck up this bill C69 to streamline Canada's regulatory review process, but there's still a large number of hurdles and unknowns that need to be addressed. We need to engage industry to help clients prepare projects for procurement, and this hasn't been done effectively. We need to encourage innovation, flexibility, adapt to scope changes, risks and opportunities, and we need to have effective risk sharing rather than risk at all costs. So it's less about allocation and more about collaboration. It's not just tough luck, and that's the position the situation we're in now. And finally, to act now. It's less about listening and more about doing and delivering. So we've tinkered around the edges in Canada, and we find we're in a position that now is the time to focus on delivering these shovel-worthy programs rather than searching for shovel-ready projects. So Canada's strongest trading partner then is, and good part of our supply chain is linked to the United States. The United States marketplace is key to our recovery. And in that context, I'm going to hand over to Mike Meyer, who will shed some light on where things are going in the US.
Thank you, Jeff. And much of what Jeff said with regard to Canada is also true in the United States. So we have not really had a stimulus package as it relates to infrastructure, at least as part of our COVID response. We've literally spent trillions of dollars helping employers, employees, government agencies, et cetera, but not so much on the infrastructure side. And as most of you know, we're in the middle of a presidential campaign, which creates all sorts of other issues. And so my suspicion is that there will not be a stimulus package, at least as part of the short-term response. But I think there's some learning that could be had by looking back at the American Recovery and Reconstruction Act of 2009, which is where we did have our last stimulus package. And in fact, in the preamble of that legislation, the number one goal was to preserve and create jobs, which I think if there were to be another stimulus-oriented package in the United States, that would also be the focus. As you can see in the figure, I'm primarily talking about transportation, and there's about $48 billion that was spent last time on transportation, primarily focused on the highways program. Next slide, please. The characteristics of that stimulus package, I think, was important. As I mentioned, the greatest focus was to get the economy back and going again, focused on both preserving and creating jobs. It was multimodal, as the prior figure shows, so it's not just highways, but it included transit, intercity rail, as well as airports. Although, again, I suspect if there were to be another stimulus package in the United States, the focus would be on highways. Next slide, please. There were certain characteristics of how this program was implemented that I suspect, again, would be true in any future stimulus package for us. It was using existing channels from the government, from the U.S. Department of Transportation, which a lot of it was done by formula based on lane miles and based on population. The governors of the state had to certify that, in fact, this additional money was over and above what had been traditionally spent in transportation to show that, in fact, it truly was a stimulus. There was a focus on trying to apply these monies to what were called economically distressed areas, which were defined as per capita income and unemployment figures. Most importantly, and this was the key to what really happened, is states were primarily given 4 months to obligate or to promise allocate dollars to certain projects, and in the highways, 50% of the projects had to be started within 4 months of the legislation, which created all sorts of challenges with regard to getting projects that weren't ready in time for the dollars to be spent. Another important characteristic is they had to apply with our National Environmental Policy Act requirements. So if a big project had not finished that process, that created another challenge as well. The legislation did, in fact, require the use or emphasize the use of fixed price contracts and competitive procedures. Those are in quotation marks, that comes right from the legislation. And as I mentioned before, the real focus was on jobs preserved and jobs created. So there was a lot of reporting requirements on the part of the DOTs and governments to report back to the federal government, how many jobs were preserved and created, which in and of itself created real challenges in how you define those particular terms. Next slide, please. So I suspect that what we're going to see in the future in the United States, with either the existing administration continuing or a new administration in place, is that instead of a stimulus package as a stimulus package, we are in a cycle to have a reauthorization of our normal transportation mega billion-dollar program, hundreds of billions of dollars usually allocated to transportation. And I think that will happen very quickly in the next term, probably in the springtime, early summer of next year. It will be a massive transportation infrastructure program. We've been talking about this for years. And I think we will continue to use our existing contractual processes and distribution processes. But my sense is that the alliance contract model really does provide a real opportunity in the United States to provide for a more efficient delivery system with regard to what the role of the private sector could be. So for some more examples of that, let me turn it over to Mike Dalton from the UK for an example of what they were doing. Mike?
Thanks, Mike. So I want to talk to all of you about how the UK government responded to the 2008-2012 recession and draw out some lessons learned on how the government in the UK sought to change infrastructure delivery. Then I'm going to jump forwards to 2020 and look at one of the UK's major infrastructure owners and how they've used the lessons learned from that recession and developed and matured their own operating model to reflect a stronger drive towards alliance working. So in 2008, as we all know, the recession was one born of market liquidity. The subprime mortgage impacted significantly on our financial institutions. Money became tight, with several implications for infrastructure in both the public and private sectors. In the UK, literally overnight, housing construction sites stopped. We in WSP found our clients simply stopped our work literally at midnight in weeks, despite the need for over 3 million new homes in the UK. In the commercial world, developers mothballed office, retail, leisure sites as money became tight and lending rates went through the roof. And in the public sector, as we all probably know, public procurement of assets is one of the key levers that government can use to save money, to streamline public spend and shape economic activity, and so to respond to recession in their own way. UK central government took a very strong grip on taxpayers' money and drove a severe austerity and efficiency programme for public infrastructure, putting significant effort into tightening up of all aspects of taxpayers' spending the money better. And local authorities today probably receive about 40 to 50% less financial support from central government than they did in 2010. A body was set up called Infrastructure UK. They did a cost review report in 2010 and identified the opportunity to improve infrastructure delivery, setting targets to remove waste and efficiency of at least 15% by 2015 in infrastructure delivery. And then the government then set out their own construction strategy for 2025, which set a target of lowering costs by 30% and delivery time by 50%. Various initiatives were also developed, but one of the key ones that we want to talk about today is the Alliance Code of Practice. So we could just change the slide, please. And I'm just going to jump forwards 5 years to 2020 from when that report was produced, and here we see these initiatives starting to bear fruit. And I'm going to look at a very new alliance here in the UK, as the alliance model, contracted model, is still maturing here. So the UK Smart Motorway Alliance. The Smart Motorway Alliance was the first such alliance to be established in the strategic road sector, indeed probably the only one that's been established so far. The Smart Motorway is converting England's motorway system to what we call smart roads through technology deployment, coupled with enhancing capacity by removing the hard shoulder in Britain on the left-hand side and converting it to a running lane. Some of those running lanes are permanently installed and some are controlled by technology where the lane is unlocked or locked according to traffic congestion. Highways England trialled the concept back in 2006 and has developed the delivery model through 2013 to 2017 with the first tranche of motorways using a traditional designer framework and a construction framework. It's had some success, but HE wanted to go a stage further and move to drive out the identified benefits of delivery efficiency that government had established back in 2015 and decided to proceed with an alliance model. Their reason was entirely in line with the concepts that an alliance work well. Smart Motor is very complex. It's a huge program of work. There's scope unpredictability. There's challenges around the required design and construction innovation, and there's program criticality, which needs to drive new ways of thinking, and all of this coupled with still resource scarcity in the market. The concept was mooted back in 16-17. We were consulted in early 18. It went to the market in December 18. And I was pleased to say that in April 2020, WSP, along with Jacobs, was awarded one of the 2 digital design spaces for the whole of England. There are then also 3 on-site assembly partners, i.e. the constructors, and then a production management partner, or better known maybe as the integrator, which was Fleur. The alliance has literally just started, and it will need all the components that an alliance must have, namely trust between the 6 partners, a shared understanding of the visions and outcomes that the client Highways England has for the customer experience, complex challenges, a critical program, but with shared risks and rewards and incentives. It's also got some of the benefits of PFI that we heard before. It's a 10.5-year alliance, 6 months to allow it to get set up, allowing the suppliers to invest over a long period, such as the setting up of programs for the long-term recruitment of youngsters to come into the industry, digital platforms, off-site construction methods, new processes and methods and systems of work to be more efficient. And most importantly, as I'm sure you'll hear from Tim in just a minute, how we will have to collaborate and be culturally aligned as alliance partners and reduce interfaces, which, as we all know, on a complex program is where the cost can be. So I'm just going to pass the baton to my colleague Tim Gosbell in Australia, where the alliance model is perhaps more mature. Tim, over to you.
Thanks, Mike, and it's a pleasure to be here. So look, alliance forms of project delivery have been part of the Australian project delivery options for over 20 years. So we've got lots of examples of refinement and evolution of the alliance model. So as we're talking about stimulus, the nature indeed of stimulus is that it's required as soon as possible. And our long-term planning cycles just don't support the traditional approaches to procurement. And we all know that the real economic benefit of the stimulus is really felt in that construction phase. So the question then, how can alliance contracting help you get to that investment and job creation much sooner rather than later? So as we know, traditional procurement can take a long time. Alliance contracts, though, enable the formation of alliance teams well before all of the planning and the scope is completely settled. And this is because it's fundamentally a collaborative form of approach, and you're defining what you're looking to achieve by way of project outcomes and the commercial model that will support that in terms of cost recovery within that alliance framework. So you can indeed commence with as little information as a business case to commence procurement. And there's a couple of variations on a theme of this model that I'll touch on briefly. So there is what is referred to as a pure alliance, which is very much a streamlined approach, and you move quite quickly to selecting a single team that you as an owner will work with. And I'm going to talk a bit more about a progressive alliance in which you might appoint a design partner, and then you'll do some work, and then later you will appoint a construction partner. Certainly what we've found in Australia is by adopting some of these collaborative and alliance forms of project delivery, we've been able to get shovel-ready projects at least 18 months sooner than some of the traditional procurement methods. Next slide, please. So what I've shown here is just a graphical representation of some procurement models. So in the top row there, you can see a traditional phase where you might do a business case, then do some design work to define the solution to help achieve the business case outcomes. And then at that point, you would do various consenting or approvals. And then your more detailed design would progress. You'd then tender for construction, then you might commence construction. Using an alliance model, you can commence tendering for your alliance team as early as that consenting and approvals phase. So you can run a procurement process, set up an interim project team that can finalize the design, get early constructor input, reflect on any constraints associated with that consenting and approvals process, and then give birth to a full alliance at the end of that consenting and approvals period. So cutting off perhaps 18 months from what you might have otherwise seen in those procurement models. One other evolution of that model shown on the bottom of the slide here is that depending on the level of support available to the owner, you might choose to retain some design expertise in the development of a reference design after you have completed the business case. Then as a secondary process, you'd run the appointment of a contractor to join the alliance, and finally you form that full alliance. So it's a progressive alliance in the sense that you have a designer, and then you bring a constructor together, and then you form that whole team. So depending on what skills you have available to you and where you are in the process, there's a couple of options. Next slide, thanks. So I just thought I'd share with you a bit of a case study of one of the projects that we've got happening here in Australia. So we've got a large portfolio of railway crossings that are at grade with the road network. In fact, there are over 160 of these crossings where I live in Melbourne in Victoria. And these crossings were having a very significant impact on the network congestion as the boom gates were staying down for longer periods of time as more and more rail services were run, and there are also safety issues. Up until the establishment of a dedicated authority to address these level crossings, they were being removed at a rate of about 2 per year. And in late 2014, there was some decisions made to fast track the delivery of those level crossings, and they set a target of delivering 20 by 2018, and now the current target is to deliver 75 by 2025. So we're currently doing now over 7 per year. So this alliance has enabled the client to procure the first of the packages. So there are 7 level crossings to be done ultimately on this package, but the procurement commenced when there was only planning work and knowledge about 1 of these level crossings. So the procurement started with 1 project in mind, but then it moved from a project into a program, and it's through the course of that program that further packages were added. So it really enabled what would otherwise been a long planning process to do all the work associated with this work. They could start early, they could get all of those participants on board, they could finish the planning, they could commence early works, and they could plan the future packages and then progressively price up and deliver those future works without having to have done that all up front. So it's proved to be a very successful model and it continues to successfully and efficiently deliver these level crossing removals. Next slide, thanks. And there's just an example of one of the finished stations that has recently been opened. So I'm going to pass now to my colleague in Christchurch in New Zealand, Simon Robertson.
Thank you very much, Tim. That's great. Hey, just building on Tim's alliance experience, we've been working not quite as long as New Zealand on alliancing, but we've had a wee bit of experience. But if we think about earthquakes almost like as a COVID shock around the planet, we had a sequence of earthquakes back a couple of years ago, and we had a major one in New Zealand in November 2016, November the 14th, 2016, but it's a 7.8 magnitude earthquake. I think it was one of the biggest in the planet at the time. And you can see there on the left-hand side, Australia, there's a wee red box there with New Zealand. You can see the North and South Island, and you can actually see the epicenter of the earthquake there. About 21 faults ruptured at once. The epicenter was just north of Christchurch in a wee seaside town, a tourist town called Kaikoura. It was the second largest natural event to actually hit the South Island in within a couple of years. So it was extensive shaking, about two minutes long, strongest recorded ground acceleration in New Zealand. The seabed rose in places by 1.5 meters over about 80 k's or 50 miles. A big tsunami, 6 or 7 meters, was generated, and the North Island actually shifted, or South Island actually shifted closer to the North Island as well. So, and just on the right-hand side there, you'll see where the epicenter was. There's mountains and there's sea. We've got quite vulnerable transport links around New Zealand. We're quite sparsely populated in the South Island, and you can see the main rail line, rail line and state highway on the edge of the sea there as well. If you could just go to the next slide, please. Thanks very much. So you'll just see some of the damage that actually happened due to the earthquake. We had around, I think it was around about almost 190 kilometers of road was damaged, 150 kilometers of rail. Tunnels were damaged, about 20 tunnels damaged, about 60 bridges. We ended up evacuating all of government response, about 2,500 people from Kaikoura by road and rail. Communities were completely chopped off. Rail was thrown into the sea, buckled, so you can see extensive damage. And you can see, I'll come back to the photo. If you just picture that one, keep that one in your head on your top right-hand side, and I'll come back to that one in just a moment. So how do we actually respond to this in New Zealand? What's a really good way to actually respond to this? So the initial response was around bringing in an alliance model. So there's basically 2 phases to this alliance model. The first phase is really just around disaster response and emergency response. and the second phase is around controlled delivery, and I'll just talk about that in just a moment. But what the alliance model worked really well in this case, and it's building on some of Tim's comments there as well. There was uncertainty in terms of what needed to happen, but spending needed to happen rapidly. So that's similar to the stimulus and spending that's going to happen that Mike's mentioned in Canada, and also Mike in the US as well, and also the UK. So spending need to happen rapidly, and this is what happened. We need to actually stimulate things. There was unique challenges around transport, the community, and to actually for the economy as well, and to also lift up tourism in the area as well. The speed of construction was essential for this, which the alliance model works really well. And picking up on the other comments that made, we didn't know the exact scale. We knew there was a major problem, of course, but we didn't know the extent of the problem. So the alliance is great that we're actually thinking about how we actually come up with the solutions and the ideas as we're actually progressing through the project, not knowing all the answers at the outset. So uncertainty around project scope and risks, hugely challenging from a technical perspective. And also those external factors that were mentioned around the environment and things we had to do around that. Huge stakeholder involvement, and this is a hugely culturally significant place for Mari as well. So it's innovative solutions, and we also needed some flexibility there on schedule and program. So the alliance really lends itself to be a fantastic model for that collaboration and partnering approach as well. So if we could just flick onto the next slide, please. A key thing here is around speed, and the speed to set the alliance. Now, a number of those traditional models that we've talked about and discussed can take many, many years to actually come to fruition. If you'll see here, day one, November the 14th, 2016, we had an interim project alliance agreement signed within 5 weeks, and that enabled the contractors that were engaged at the time to do the emergency works to actually carry on and sign up that IPAA. There was 4 contractors involved and 2 owner participants, which is Kiwi Rail and Waka Kotahi, which is NZTA, the agency. So week 5, you can say IPA signed, and week 14, which is just 3 months after that major event, the full PAA was signed. And a couple of comments I made earlier on was there was emergency response for the first phase, and then controlled delivery. So how to help accelerate the process? So the alliance worked extremely well in this case because we had procurement processes developed in parallel with the work that was actually happening. Design was in parallel with the delivery team or the construction team. Sometimes construction a wee bit ahead of design, so there's a bit of a catch up there as well. And also scope definition and the target outturn cost development process was also developed in parallel. But there's key factors, they've been touched on by Tim. The key factors here around having behaviors around the team, a really focused project culture, really strong relationships, and excellent governance. So you do need a board in place, and you do need to have those people with those behaviors in place, and lots of coaching as well to support that. So the fully integrated team, common project focus, common aims, and we've had some fantastic outcomes. If we can just have a quick look at that last slide, a couple of comments to finish off. And you'll see this is one of our major areas that cause lots of issue. There is a rail tunnel behind the hill or the mountain there, and you can see there's a seawall there. Many solutions. There's a seawall there that's about 10 to 11 meters high. Its highest point 30 to 40 feet high. It's a couple of kilometers long, and the overall construction cost is going to work out about $1.2 billion over about a 3-year period, and developed with urgency, but with controlled delivery. So the alliance really works here. Just down on your bottom left-hand side, you'll see something that's just been developed by the construction sector accord through the New Zealand government. There is it's basically a rapid mobilization playbook. We can actually send a link out to that one to the participants as need be, but it's really around various bits of information around being fast, being meaningful, and being safe, and all sorts of different templates, background, and it also explains different models you can actually use to try and help stimulate jobs and stimulate the economy and actually get projects off the ground quickly. So that's a really useful guide with various bits of information that will support it. That's me for New Zealand. If I'll just hand you back over to Corey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. And if we want to pull up the cameras of the panelists. Thanks everybody for listening. We are going to take a few question and answers right now. There is a question panel in the drop-down menu as part of the webinar. If you'd like to put your questions in there, we've already received a number during the session as well as prior. We may not be able to get to all the questions, but what we will do is in a follow-up, we will answer or address all of the questions asked, some of them in written form if we don't get to them here. But we will take a couple. And first, I'm going to go to Tim. And Tim, a lot of times owners, if they don't understand or know the alliance model, may be hesitant to uptake it and get into something very new in a time of need from their broader communities. In your experience with Australia being very mature, how have the owners there taken up the alliance model? What hurdles did they have to overcome to make it a core component of their delivery?
Yeah, thanks, Corey. And it has been an evolution. And originally, clients were very unsure about the alliance model, particularly, I think, where they felt that perhaps they didn't have the right sort of expertise to put into the alliance. But I think what people need to understand is there is a single integrated project team. There is no owner's engineer or other bodies that might be reviewing or checking. It's all integrated in the alliance. So you're assembling this team, and as a client, you recognize that you have some strengths and you have some weaknesses, and you will put people into that alliance which bring the strengths of your organization, and you will look for the other alliance participants to bring those complementary gaps into the team and form a single high-performing team, strong culture, all focused on a singular successful outcome. And success breeds success. When these alliances have been delivering good outcomes for these clients, they're gaining confidence and they're doing more and more of them.
Thanks, Tim. It's interesting too, because you did mention in the presentation how a program can grow from one initial contract to many others. If a client is looking at an existing program that they may want to, as part of their stimulus package, grow and bring other contracts into it, is there a way to transition an existing traditional or design and build, design and construct contract into an alliance type framework where you can start to build on that overall program?
Yeah, I think you can, Corey. I've got a good example right now where a client is delivering a project using a design build framework. All parties are not getting the outcomes they hope for. They're taking time out and they're going to reset that project as an alliance. So there'll be certain contractual things that need to happen. The biggest single challenge, though, is the cultural change that needs to take place within that alliance. An alliance is fundamentally a collaborative, no blame arrangement, and you're all in it together, and there can only be win-win or lose-lose outcomes, and everybody is rewarded and shares in the success in a project. Whereas traditional models, you often have, master-slave type arrangements, and so those behaviours really need to change. The contract is the easy part, the behaviours is the challenge.
Perfect, thanks. And Simon, I'm wondering from your experience in New Zealand, is there a size of project that typically lends itself more effectively to an alliance model? Or can you deliver a small project under $100 million via alliance?
Yeah, look, there was a certain figure that we use in New Zealand around the transportation is around about that $250 mark to make an alliance effective. There's a lot of the setup costs and ongoing costs for that project. So below that, it starts to become less efficient as opposed to other actual models. And you've got to think New Zealand is actually a smaller country, so our scale of projects isn't as large as you could get in like the US or Canada, UK. However, there's no reason within Australia, within the UK and other areas that $200 million mark couldn't be used, or obviously larger than that one as well, though. So that's kind of the lower level we'd actually go to here. That seems to be quite effective.
Great, thanks. And we have received, a kind of building off of what projects are eligible or most effective for Alliance, we have received a couple questions on what we mean by shovel ready versus shovel worthy. And when governments and policymakers are looking to where they put their money, what exactly does that mean? Jeff, maybe I'll go over to you because you really brought that shovel worthy up, and maybe you could spend the next 30 seconds just to explain what you mean by shovel worthy.
Sure, it's a good question. The shovel ready focuses on projects that are basically ready for construction. There's no consideration given to the benefits it will have in supporting the development or stimulate economic recovery. So an example may be, we'll take the opportunity of the stimulus funding to advance the construction and develop a maintenance and storage facility, for example, for transit. That's a shovel-ready project. The shovel-worthy then really meets all of the program objectives of the government. So it supports economic development. It meets in the case of Canada, it meets our climate resiliency objectives, and it employs people. So using the above example of the maintenance and storage facility, the shovel-worthy project would be to develop the maintenance storage facility, but to rough in or to have it ready for electrification. So what we're doing in one case is we're developing a maintenance and storage facility, but it is going to be a maintenance storage facility ready for electrification when that agency then transitions its bus fleet from a diesel to an electric fleet. So it meets the government's program objectives, and it's ready to develop.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff.
And Corey, if I could add on to that very quickly, in our example, the United States last time around, the shovel-ready projects were projects like repaving roads and highways. So there was a lot of repaving projects going on, even where they weren't necessarily needed, but just simply because they were ready to go. Versus long-term, bigger projects that would really contribute to more economic productivity and economic benefits. So I completely agree with Jeff that the difference between shovel-ready and shovel-worthy, I think, is a very important distinction, and one that we need to think about as we talk about stimulus in the future.
Absolutely, it's opportunistic versus
right,
program supportive.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael. And kind of it brings into question to make sure we're all looking at this stimulus spending effectively moving forward. And I'm curious, and maybe this question is directed towards Tim and Simon. Has there ever been any historical evidence to show, is an alliance seeing a more cost-effective way of delivering infrastructure versus traditional or design build?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Corey, and it often gets asked around, how do you know this collaborative model delivers improved value for money? Because honestly, you never really get two identical projects that you can run in parallel and say, let's do that one design build, and let's do that one alliance, and let's see the outcome. However, there is a lot of work done around in alliances, the definition of what is value for money, and post-construction implementation reports done to then retrospectively determine and audit and validate, did we get value for money out of that work? And there's been a recent audit done by the Auditor General, where I am here in Victoria, across the level crossing programs, that really confirmed that the program alliances that I was referring to are delivering considerable value to the state over and above other traditional or other delivery methods that are being considered. So it will always vary, but there's pretty strong evidence out there that they are delivering value at the moment.
Perfect, thanks. And I think, for the sake of time, I think we're going to take one more question. Again, we will look to all the questions that have been asked. Thank you for those, and we will address them in a response via written communication. But this final question is for Mike Dalton. And the UK and the smart motorways, you guys are going through a transition right now where you're looking at alliancing as more of a core component of your delivery models. What has been the biggest learning for you, for WSP, for the Smart Alliance, the Smart Motorways owners on taking alliancing on and using that as a delivery method?
Great question, Corey, mainly because it's all quite new to us, really. But I think what's going to be very interesting is working with, in an integrated manner, as Tim has described, with 3 of the UK's biggest tier 1 contractors, Balfour Beatty, Morgan Stanley and Costain, with an American consultancy, Fleur, as the integrator, and with Highways England too, who are also in the tent. And as I said in the presentation, it's a 10.5-year program, but the client rather wisely has put the first 6 months of that 10.5 years towards setting up everything that needs to be set up, from the digital platforms to the alliancing to the behavioural alignment, the cultural alignment, because the payback for this is not going to happen over a couple of years. It's going to take probably 10 years in order for the investment that all the partners have got to put forwards to pay back to those partners. So it's early days, Corey, and it'd be good to do this webinar perhaps in a year's time when we can actually give you a more informed insight to how it's working. But it's exciting because it's the first time that this client's ever done it, and it's the first. There are alliances in the UK, but they're not. I don't think they've been. None of them have been awarded through the NEC for Alliance contract, which is a new bespoke form of contracting for the UK industry. So early days, but we can come back and inform you later.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. And that's it. Well, we won't take any more questions. Just seeing the time now, as we're almost at the top of the hour. There will be a survey that's prompted at the close of this session. Please feel free to fill out, provide feedback on any information you'd like to hear, or future webinar sessions you'd like to see. Again, we will try and answer all the questions via written communication. So I'd like to thank the panelists for their time and the attendees on the line for listening. Thank you very much.
Thanks all. Thanks, Corey.
Thank you.
Thank you.